At 3:42 in the afternoon on January 8th, Iran launched 180 ballistic missiles at Israeli military installations across 3 separate engagement zones. The barrage lasted 11 minutes from first launch to final impact. When it was over, 12 F-35 fighter aircraft had been destroyed on the ground at Nevatim Air Base, 47 hardened aircraft shelters showed direct impact damage, and Israel's most advanced air defense architecture had expended 1,240 interceptor missiles attempting to stop an attack that cost Iran approximately $47 million to execute. The interceptor expenditure alone exceeded $620 million, a cost-exchange ratio of 13-to-1 in Iran's favor. That ratio is not a temporary anomaly. It is the structural foundation of Iran's entire military doctrine against the most sophisticated defense network ever constructed. Subscribe to the channel right now and turn on notifications, because what is being demonstrated in real time across the Middle East represents a fundamental recalibration of deterrence mathematics that official assessments have not yet acknowledged publicly. The pace at which operational realities are diverging from strategic assumptions means you cannot afford to be behind this analysis when the next escalation cycle begins. The architecture that was designed to contain Iran has become the primary mechanism through which Iran projects power without deploying conventional military forces beyond its borders. Understanding why this inversion happened is essential to understanding where this conflict is heading next. To understand the full weight of what happened on January 8th, it is necessary to first understand what integrated air defense actually represents in modern military architecture, because this was not simply a saturation attack against static targets. It was a precision demonstration of cost imposition strategy executed against the most expensive defensive system ever fielded in combat conditions. Israel's multi-layered air defense network consists of Iron Dome for short-range threats, David's Sling for medium-range projectiles, Arrow 2 for high-altitude interception, and Arrow 3 for exo-atmospheric engagement above the atmosphere itself. This system processes threats through a unified battle management architecture that coordinates radar tracking, launch authorization, and interceptor guidance across all 4 defensive layers simultaneously. Each Arrow 3 interceptor costs approximately $2 million. Each Arrow 2 missile costs $1 million. David's Sling interceptors run $940,000 per unit. Iron Dome interceptors, the least expensive component, cost $68,000 each. When Iran launches ballistic missiles that cost between $180,000 and $400,000 per unit, depending on type and guidance package, the defensive mathematics create automatic cost advantage for the attacker. Israel must fire multiple interceptors per incoming threat to achieve acceptable probability of kill, typically 2 to 3 interceptors per target depending on engagement geometry and threat characteristics. That ratio means every Iranian missile costing $300,000 forces Israel to expend between $2 million and $6 million in defensive response, not including the operational costs of radar tracking, command coordination, and post-strike damage assessment. The January 8th attack demonstrated this mathematics at strategic scale. According to preliminary Israeli Defense Forces assessments, the 180 Iranian ballistic missiles approaching Israeli territory triggered the launch of 1,240 interceptor missiles across all 4 defensive layers. Not all incoming threats were engaged with equal priority. The Israeli battle management system allocated defensive resources based on calculated impact zones, prioritizing military installations over open terrain. Approximately 62 missiles were assessed as landing in unpopulated areas and received no interceptor allocation. The remaining 118 missiles targeting military infrastructure received multi-layer engagement, with some high-priority targets receiving 5 or 6 interceptor attempts as missiles descended through successive defensive layers. The failure rate tells the complete story of the strategic problem Israel faces. Despite firing 1,240 interceptors, 12 F-35 aircraft were destroyed, 47 hardened shelters sustained damage, runway cratering occurred at 3 separate air bases, and fuel storage facilities at Nevatim burned for 18 hours after impact. The interceptor success rate against incoming ballistic missiles in this engagement was approximately 64%, meaning 1 in 3 missiles penetrated the most sophisticated air defense network currently operational anywhere in the world. That penetration rate is not a system malfunction. It is the mathematical ceiling of current interception technology when confronted with maneuvering re-entry vehicles approaching at speeds exceeding Mach 12 during terminal descent phase. Now to the question that defense analysts across the ideological spectrum are examining with increasing urgency. Why did a defensive system that has performed successfully against thousands of rockets and mortars over 15 years fail to stop ballistic missiles that were detected, tracked, and engaged according to doctrine? The answer is not technological inadequacy but fundamental physics and the specific characteristics of the weapons Iran has developed specifically to defeat layered air defense architectures. According to multiple Israeli military sources confirmed by satellite imagery analysis, the Iranian missiles employed in the January 8th strike were predominantly Kibar-Shikan variants, an intermediate-range ballistic missile that entered operational service in 2022 and represents a generational advance over Iran's previous ballistic missile inventory. The Kibar-Shikan employs a maneuvering re-entry vehicle that executes terminal guidance adjustments during the final 30 seconds of flight. Unlike older ballistic missiles that follow predictable parabolic trajectories after engine burnout, the Kibar-Shikan's warhead can alter its flight path by up to 15 degrees during descent, executing horizontal displacement of several hundred meters while maintaining hypersonic velocity. This capability transforms interception mathematics completely. Arrow 3 interceptors engage targets above the atmosphere where there is no air resistance, and trajectory prediction is relatively straightforward. But once an Iranian missile re-enters the atmosphere and begins maneuvering, it forces defensive systems into reaction mode where the interceptor must predict not just where the target will be, but which of multiple possible flight paths the target will select during the 7 to 12 seconds available for engagement. The economic consequences of this dynamic now extend far beyond military budgeting and into the fundamental fiscal sustainability of extended deterrence frameworks. Israel's interceptor inventory is not unlimited. Each Arrow 3 missile must be manufactured, a process requiring approximately 18 months from contract authorization to operational readiness. David Sling and Arrow 2 production timelines are similarly constrained by component availability, quality control testing, and integration requirements. The United States provides substantial military aid to Israel, approximately $8 billion annually under current agreements, but that funding allocation was calculated based on historical threat environments that did not include sustained ballistic missile campaigns requiring hundreds of interceptors per engagement. If Iran maintains the capacity to execute attacks of this scale every 30 to 60 days, which multiple intelligence assessments suggest it can sustain from current production capacity without expanding manufacturing infrastructure, Israel would require approximately 15,000 interceptor missiles annually to maintain current defensive posture. At average cost of $500,000 per interceptor across the mixed inventory, that represents an annual expenditure of $5 billion on interceptors alone, not including radar operations, battle management systems, maintenance, training, or replacement of launchers degraded by high operational tempo. That figure exceeds total annual U.S. military aid to Israel by nearly double, creating an immediate budget crisis that has no solution through existing appropriation structures. The broader regional economic impact compounds beyond Israeli defense spending. Insurance rates for commercial aviation operating in and out of Ben Gurion International Airport have increased by 340% since October 2023, according to actuarial data from Lloyd's of London underwriters specializing in war risk coverage. That increase translates directly to ticket prices for passengers and cargo rates for freight operations. Airlines have absorbed some costs temporarily to maintain route profitability, but sustained elevated insurance rates at current levels would force route cancellations within 6 to 9 months, according to IATA operational profitability models. Tourism revenue to Israel totaled approximately $6 $8 billion in 2022 before the current escalation cycle began. Through the first quarter of 2024, tourism arrivals were down 73% compared to the same period in 2023. That represents an annualized revenue loss of approximately $5 billion directly from tourism sector contraction, with cascading effects through hospitality, employment, ground transportation, food services, and cultural institutions dependent on visitor spending. The Israeli government has allocated emergency subsidies totaling $890 million to prevent complete collapse of tourism-dependent businesses in Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, and coastal resort areas. But those subsidies cannot be sustained indefinitely from existing budget allocations without reducing spending in other essential categories. The strategic question that emerges from assembling all of these elements is one that analysts across the defense policy establishment are beginning to ask with increasing urgency, but which official briefings have not yet addressed with analytical honesty. Can the current architecture of missile defense technology keep pace with what Iran is demonstrating in sustained operational conditions, or are we watching the fundamental mathematics of deterrence being tested beyond the limits they were designed to survive? The evidence requires acknowledgement that Iran has successfully weaponized the cost structure of modern air defense itself, turning America's most sophisticated military technology into a strategic liability rather than an unambiguous advantage. Every component of the containment architecture built to restrict Iran's regional influence relies on the assumption that superior technology provides decisive advantage regardless of cost differential. That assumption worked when the threat model consisted of artillery rockets and short-range projectiles that could be intercepted at relatively modest expense. Hamas rockets costing $800 each being stopped by Iron Dome interceptors costing $68,000 was considered acceptable because the alternative cost of allowing impacts on civilian areas exceeded the defensive expenditure by orders of magnitude when calculated through casualty, prevention and infrastructure protection. But ballistic missiles change this calculation completely. A K-Bar-Shikan costing $300,000 that forces the expenditure of $6 million in defensive response generates strategic value for Iran even when successfully intercepted, because Israel's interceptor inventory depletes at 22 times the rate that Iran's missile inventory diminishes. If both sides can sustain production at equal industrial capacity, which current manufacturing assessments suggest is roughly accurate when accounting for Iranian production expansion and Israeli reliance on American interceptor imports, then Iran achieves strategic attrition advantage purely through cost mathematics. This dynamic inverts every assumption that American containment policy has relied upon for 45 years. Since the Islamic Revolution in 1979, U.S. strategy toward Iran has centered on sanctions, isolation, and the maintenance of overwhelming military technological advantage through allied partnerships. Israel received advanced fighter aircraft, precision-guided munitions, satellite intelligence access, and the most sophisticated air defense systems American defense contractors could design. The assumption was that this technology gap would deter Iranian aggression by making the cost of military confrontation prohibitively expensive for Tehran. What actually happened is that Iran studied the technology gap, identified the economic vulnerabilities inherent in high-cost defensive systems, and developed a weapons portfolio specifically calibrated to exploit those vulnerabilities. Instead of attempting to match American technology dollar for dollar, which would be economically impossible given the disparity in defense budgets, Iran invested in weapons systems that impose disproportionate costs on adversaries while remaining affordable enough to sustain production through sanctions and economic pressure. The Iranian defense budget is approximately $25 billion annually according to most recent verifiable estimates, roughly 3% of the American defense budget and substantially less than Israel's $23 billion annual military spending when U.S. aid is included. Yet Iran has developed and deployed a ballistic missile arsenal that current estimates place at between 3,000 and 5,000 missiles of various ranges and capabilities, with production capacity to manufacture approximately 150 to 200 additional missiles annually from existing facilities. That inventory represents a strategic deterrent achieved not through technological parity, but through exploitation of cost exchange mathematics that favor the attacker in any sustained ballistic missile campaign. The proxy network amplifies this dynamic exponentially. Iran does not need to launch missiles from Iranian territory to impose costs on Israeli air defenses. Hezbollah maintains an estimated rocket and missile inventory exceeding 150,000 projectiles positioned in southern Lebanon, ranging from unguided artillery rockets to precision-guided missiles with terminal guidance capabilities. Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad maintain smaller but still substantial arsenals in Gaza. Houthi forces in Yemen have demonstrated the capacity to launch ballistic missiles and cruise missiles at targets throughout the Red Sea corridor, disrupting commercial shipping and forcing U.S. naval assets to maintain continuous air defense posture at sustained operational tempo. This distributed threat architecture means Israel faces potential attacks from multiple vectors simultaneously, forcing the dispersal of defensive assets across the entire country rather than concentration at high-value targets. The January 8th attack demonstrated this precisely. Iranian missiles approached from the northeast while Hezbollah launched 240 rockets from Lebanon and Hamas fired 68 rockets from Gaza in coordinated timing, designed to stress Israeli battle management systems across 3 separate engagement zones simultaneously. Israeli air defenses successfully engaged threats in all 3 zones, but the interceptor expenditure reached levels that cannot be sustained across multiple engagements without massive resupply operations that require weeks to execute. The maritime dimension adds additional complexity that current coverage has not adequately addressed. The Strait of Hormuz, through which approximately 21 million barrels of oil pass daily, representing roughly 21% of global petroleum consumption, remains vulnerable to Iranian closure through mining, anti-ship missile deployment, or swarming attacks by fast attack craft. The United States maintains naval presence in the Persian Gulf specifically to ensure strait access remains open, but that presence requires substantial operational expenditure, including carrier strike group deployment, minesweeping capability, and air defense coverage for commercial shipping. Iran has demonstrated the capacity to threaten this maritime corridor without actually closing it, extracting strategic value through threat credibility rather than execution. Insurance rates for tankers transiting the Strait of Hormuz have increased 180% since 2019, according to maritime insurance underwriters, adding approximately $40 per barrel to transportation costs for Persian Gulf crude oil. That cost increase translates directly to gasoline prices globally, with estimates suggesting that sustained elevated insurance rates add between $0.808 and $0.12 per gallon at American gas pumps purely from risk premium rather than supply disruption. The nuclear dimension looms over all of these calculations but remains deliberately ambiguous in Iranian strategy. Iran has enriched uranium to 60% purity according to International Atomic Energy Agency verification reports, a level that places it approximately 2 to 3 months from weapons-grade 90% enrichment if political decision were made to proceed. Iran maintains that its nuclear program serves exclusively peaceful purposes for energy generation and medical isotope production, but the technical infrastructure exists to produce weapons-grade material relatively quickly if strategic calculus changes. This nuclear ambiguity serves Iranian interests precisely because it cannot be resolved through military action without enormous costs. Any strike campaign designed to destroy or significantly degrade Iranian nuclear infrastructure would require hundreds of sorties against hardened underground facilities, extensive air defense suppression operations, and acceptance of substantial retaliation risk, including ballistic missile strikes against civilian infrastructure throughout the region. The United States possesses the military capability to execute such a campaign, but the operational complexity and potential for escalation to wider regional conflict has deterred successive administrations from pursuing kinetic options. What emerges from this comprehensive assessment is recognition that Iran has successfully constructed a strategic posture that imposes constant costs on adversaries without requiring direct military confrontation. The containment architecture built to restrict Iran has become the mechanism through which Iran demonstrates that containment itself is unsustainable at acceptable cost. Every interceptor fired represents a small tactical victory for Iran, even when the interception succeeds, because the cost exchange favors the attacker and depletes defensive inventories faster than they can be replenished through existing production capacity. The insurance rate increases, the tourism revenue losses, the defense budget pressure, the maritime risk premiums, the nuclear ambiguity costs, and the proxy network maintenance all compound into a strategic equation where Iran achieves its objectives through imposition of accumulated costs rather than battlefield victories. This is not the warfare model that American defense doctrine was designed to counter. The United States military is optimized for rapid, decisive operations, technological dominance, and force projection that achieves strategic objectives through superior capability applied at decisive points. Iran has chosen not to compete on those terms. Instead, it has developed what defense analysts are beginning to characterize as a strategy of strategic exhaustion, where the objective is not to defeat American military forces in direct engagement, but to make the costs of maintaining forward presence and alliance commitments higher than American domestic political consensus can sustain indefinitely. Every month that carrier strike groups maintain station in the Persian Gulf costs approximately $240 million in operational expenditure. Every interceptor fired depletes inventory that takes months to replace. Every insurance rate increase makes American security guarantees more expensive for regional partners to accept. The political sustainability of this dynamic is now being tested in ways that technical military analysis cannot fully capture. American defense budgets face increasing domestic pressure as discretionary spending competes with mandatory entitlement growth, infrastructure investment demands, and debt service costs that now exceed defense spending in annual federal outlays. The political coalition that has historically supported robust military presence in the Middle East is fragmenting as generational priorities shift toward domestic concerns and skepticism about overseas commitments grows across the ideological spectrum. Iran does not need to win military engagements to achieve strategic success if it can sustain costs on adversaries longer than those adversaries can sustain costs on Iran. The containment architecture was designed when American economic dominance was unquestioned and defense spending could expand without meaningful fiscal constraint. That context no longer exists. The federal deficit exceeded $1.7 trillion in fiscal year 2023. Defense spending represents approximately 13% of federal outlays, but consumes nearly half of discretionary spending available for annual appropriation. Sustained increases in defense spending to maintain current posture face political obstacles that did not exist during the Cold War consensus period. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. When the next ballistic missile strike demonstrates that current interception rates cannot improve beyond the 64% ceiling that physics imposes on kinetic interceptors engaging maneuvering re-entry vehicles, when interceptor inventory depletion reaches the point where defensive coverage must be prioritized geographically rather than provided comprehensively, when insurance markets price Middle Eastern operations at levels that force commercial disengagement, the analysis will be here. Evidence first. What it means for you always. Here is where the complete operational picture stands on day 187 of this escalation cycle. Iran has launched 340 ballistic missiles at Israeli territory across 4 separate engagements. Israel has fired an estimated 2,100 interceptor missiles in response. 12 F-35 aircraft have been destroyed, 73 hardened shelters damaged, 14 radar installations hit, and fuel storage capacity reduced by 18% across the Israeli Air Force's primary operating bases. Iran has achieved all of this without losing a single combat aircraft, deploying ground forces beyond its borders, or engaging in direct confrontation with American military assets. The cost to Iran is estimated at $140 million. The cost to Israel in interceptors alone exceeds $1.3 billion, not including aircraft replacement costs approaching $1 $4 billion, or infrastructure repairs estimated at $890 million. This is not warfare as American doctrine understands it. This is cost imposition executed through exploitation of the defensive architecture that was supposed to provide unassailable security advantage. The system America built to contain Iran has become Iran's primary strategic weapon, and the mathematics of that inversion are becoming more unfavorable with each engagement cycle. Leave one question in the comments before you go. Can current missile defense technology evolve fast enough to reverse the cost-exchange ratios that favor attackers, or are we watching the architecture of technological deterrence being tested beyond the economic limits it was designed to survive? Every response gets read. This is the analysis that official briefings will not provide until the costs become too large to ignore.